All right, so we got some pretty terrifying updates coming out of Eastern Europe, where it seems like NATO has officially decided to expand the amount of troops that they are going to be deploying into our Eastern European NATO members. So this is absolutely terrifying for a number of different reasons. Obviously, Vladimir Putin is continuing his all-out offensive in Ukraine. It pretty much seems like he is trying to surround the capital of Kiev right now. I'm going to give you guys a little bit of an update on what it's looking like on the ground, but it does kind of seem like he's leaning towards trying to maybe install a pro-Russian government in Kiev, or whatever he may be doing. He is still continuing this all-out offensive against the entire country. Now, that does not necessarily mean that he has further ambitions, right? It doesn't mean that he's then going to march onward west to Poland, or that he's going to try to invade Romania or any other potential NATO countries. So why exactly are they doing this? Well, let's just go ahead and see what they got to say here. So from CNN, they say, for the first time, NATO response force has been activated as a defensive measure in response to Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine. And they say NATO's Supreme Allied Commander General Todd Wolters activated the multinational force consisting of land, air, sea, and special operations from the allies that can deploy quickly in support of the NATO alliance. And they say the activation of the response troops does not mean that any US or NATO troops will go into Ukraine. That's good, at least, because, I mean, understand, if NATO forces come into contact with Russian forces, that is World War III, okay? So pretty good that they're not sending them directly into the conflict zone. And they say Ukraine, which is not a member, and U.S. President Joe Biden has been clear that U.S. troops are deploying to Eastern Europe to help bolster NATO countries nervous about Russia's aggressive actions, and that they will not be fighting in Ukraine. They're also most likely going to be helping just with logistics of handling some of the migrant outflows, the refugee crisis that we are about to see unfold and are currently seeing the early stages of unfolding. Most likely, U.S. troops, especially in like Poland, are going to be seeing a massive influx of refugees as this continues happening. But they continue saying, quote, "This is a historic moment and the first time the alliance has employed these high readiness forces in a deterrence and defensive role. They represent a flexible combat and credible force that can be employed in multiple ways," and blah, 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 just basically gassing up NATO and their capabilities, of course, deploying or portraying them as purely defensive. And we're going to get to my arguments on this in a minute. I don't think that NATO is inherently a defensive alliance in any way, shape, or form. Just go look at the history of their involvement in Libya, their involvement in Afghanistan, multiple different examples. NATO is not an inherently defensive coalition necessarily, but they say the force has not yet been deployed, but it is on standby, and it's not clear how many exact troop numbers that this force will contain. I've seen estimates anywhere from 40,000 to 50,000, which that's just an absolutely massive force to be sending to this region right now, given how volatile and chaotic the situation is. Honestly, I don't really see what the benefit of this is, because unless you have information that is definitively saying that Vladimir Putin is in fact going to continue his ambitions beyond just Ukraine, then I don't really see what the benefit of this is, because it seems like you're just putting more forces in position to potentially get caught up in some human error, some fuck up, where there is contact between NATO forces in one of these Eastern European countries and Russian soldiers. And that is something that, above everything else, right, obviously you still feel for the people in Ukraine. You're still trying to give them solidarity and support in whatever ways logistically possible right now. But on top of that, what you're talking about with potential contact between Russian and NATO forces is straight up nuclear holocaust. I mean, I don't really know how much more simply to put it, okay? NATO and Russia absolutely cannot afford to come into contact on purpose or accidentally in this moment right now. So that's kind of why I'm looking at this situation and being like, what is the actual, advantage to doing something like this? Why would you send additional forces and just increase the likelihood that there's going to be some sort of a conflict there that could spark off into an entire global war? It seems like that's kind of a bad thing, but just to give you more of a perspective in terms of the nature of NATO, because it's perfectly valid and fine to criticize the imperialist actions of Vladimir Putin while also understanding some of the arguments that he has been making throughout this entire process, and also understanding a little bit of the history of NATO as an alliance, because this is it doesn't make you a State Department propagandist to say that Vladimir Putin is a violent imperialist. It also doesn't make you a Russian propagandist to point out that NATO is also a violent imperialist coalition, essentially, or at least a coalition of violent imperialist nations like the United States and the UK and France and Germany, etc. So you got to have a nuanced approach to this. You got to be able to look at both sides objectively in this situation. And so just to give you a little bit of perspective of the timeline of how NATO has developed and why Vladimir Putin claims that NATO expansionism is one of the reasons he felt compelled to go into Ukraine. I'm not saying that that is the only reason. I'm not even saying that's the biggest reason that he decided to inevitably invade Ukraine. I'm just saying this is part of it. And when you look at this as analogously to how the United States behaved, for example, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, you kind of see that maybe NATO should not be expanding all up onto the borders of Russia in the first place. But they say, so just a little bit of a timeline here. So from 1949, this is what the original sort of NATO membership was looking like, right? The major countries here, you got Portugal down here, France, you have Italy, the Netherlands, etc. So a couple different major countries, as well as West Germany, that was admitted later in 1955. And basically, after the Soviet Union collapsed, we made a promise, not written on paper or in any formal agreements, but it was pretty much understood at the time that there was an agreement that NATO would not be expanded past Eastern Germany, and yet that's exactly what we did, pretty much almost immediately with the German portion. But in the 1990s, 1999, 2004, and all the way up into 2020, you can see how NATO has been expanding eastward. And I'm not trying to give any justification in any way, shape, or form to Putin invading Ukraine. That's completely separate to this, but you kind of understand, because why the fuck are we admitting Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, countries that are literally on the border of Russia, or even discussing the possibility of Ukraine at some point in the future, maybe not becoming a member of NATO? That is not something that we would tolerate here. And so just to give you an analogy, okay, this would be the equivalent to Russia or China or both of them forming a military pact, okay? Nuclear armed superpowers forming a military pact with, let's say, Mexico right on our border, and then they start shipping their weapons to Mexico. They start training, military coalitions in Mexico. They maybe even station some of their troops there and build military bases. Do you think that there is any chance in hell that the United States would put up with that happening? No, of course they wouldn't. And again, we saw exactly what the United States would do in response to this type of behavior, because we saw how the Cuban Missile Crisis unfolded. And essentially, just in a very reductive capacity here, the United States, the prospect of the Soviet Union giving missiles, giving weapon supplies to be stationed in Cuba, that alone was seen as virtually an act of war here in the United States. And we literally almost went to nuclear war over this issue, okay? So we know for a fact that historically, at least, the United States would not be willing to have a Russian or Chinese or any sort of, imperial competitor have a military alliance directly on our borders. So why are we doing this? Why? At the very least, even if you wanted to make this argument, let's say you take Ukraine, their potential NATO membership, completely off the table. That's what Vladimir Putin claims is one of his major grievances right now. Why would you not take that off the table and just say, no, we're not going to admit Ukraine to NATO at any point in the future, right? Why would you not just take that off the table to, at the very minimum, take away that propaganda piece from Putin, so that you could then say, if he still decides to complete the invasion of Ukraine and completely take it over, you could then say, listen, there was no threat of NATO expansion, so this is just Putin being an imperialist aggressor and trying to expand the reach of the Russian Empire that he's trying to reconstruct, or whatever his motivations may be. It doesn't really make sense from any angle to continue expanding NATO in this way, or to even keep the door open for Ukrainian NATO membership. And listen, a lot of the members that are already within NATO didn't want Ukraine to be a part of NATO. It wasn't realistically going to happen. So why are we keeping that on the table? Why were we not willing to, before this invasion started, go to Vladimir Putin and take that off the table and make some initial concessions to, again, rally the world against Vladimir Putin if he then continued to go and invade Ukraine? Because you could have turned around and said, no, it wasn't about NATO expansionism, but we didn't decide to do that. So, there's a couple different areas where we could have tackled this in a different way, both over the last, 30 years or so, that we could have handled the fall of the Soviet Union in a better way that would have been less antagonistic towards Russia. But again, at the end of the day, I'm not trying to make any excuses for Vladimir Putin or any of the actions that he has taken. He is a violent capitalist imperialist. And so, if you've been following my channel for a while, you'll know those are the main standards that I try to set for myself, right? I am anti-war, I am anti-capitalist, I am anti-imperialist. And if you're going to be any of those things, you should be able to criticize both NATO and the United States imperialism and the actions that they have taken historically. And you should also be able to criticize and have valid, nuanced takes on what Vladimir Putin is doing and acknowledge that he is also an oligarch, a capitalist, a violent imperialist, okay? Both of those things can be true at the same time, and I don't really understand why people want to make this like a purely simple black and white, good guy, bad guy type of issue, when it's clearly, two imperial coalitions or two imperial powers just swinging their dicks around while they're essentially risking the end of the world. They are essentially risking a nuclear war. So not exactly something we should be fucking around with or, playing with here, but just to give you a perspective on the current situation on the ground, it is not looking great, okay? It seems like Kiev, in all likelihood, will most likely fall to the Russians within a couple days, maybe a week or so, but this is all progressing really, really quickly. So just an update here from The Guardian. They say Russian forces tighten hold on Kiev in attempt to topple government. Russian offensive facing stiffer resistance than anticipated, but nonetheless, Russian forces, they say, have tightened their stranglehold on the Ukrainian capital of Kiev and carried out amphibious assaults on the country from the Sea of Azov's coast in an attempt to topple the government. And they say almost exactly 30 years after the devastating siege of Sarajevo, another major European capital came under heavy bombardment with shells hitting apartment blocks, driving up the civilian death toll. And after the second day of the invasion, it was clear that it was being fiercely resisted, but also that Russia had much more military might yet to be unleashed on its neighbor. So, the Ukrainians putting up somewhat of a good fight here on the defensive, but the reality of the situation is you're dealing with the Russian military, arguably the second or third largest military force on the planet. So, inevitably, it seems like they're going to get overrun, right? They're not having external, military backup from any of the NATO member countries, not from the United States. We're sending them weapons, etc., but that can only do so much. At the end of the day, if, your capital gets surrounded by Russian forces, then there's not really much that you can do. So it does seem like it's a pretty bleak situation for Ukrainians right now. Obviously, at the end of the day, primary concern is civilians. You don't want innocent civilians being caught up in this. Inevitably, there have been and will continue to be civilian deaths and casualties as this continues right now. But, at the end of the day, NATO forces being deployed to the region doesn't seem like a great idea to me. Seems like that's only escalatory and increasing the likelihood of a NATO-Russian conflict from brewing. But still, Vladimir Putin, the very obvious and clear aggressor in this circumstance, and it's looking pretty dark. We're going to see pretty much the trajectory that this is heading on probably in the next couple of days. But even the president of Ukraine is acknowledging how bleak it is right now. He just gave a speech to a couple of other allied nations and basically said, this might be the last time that I'm talking to you guys. And he's apparently heading out onto the streets to join his forces. So we'll see how this develops. Pretty chaotic and terrible situation, and all solidarity with both the Ukrainians and also the Russian protesters that continue to oppose Putin's violent imperial aggression.